sponsors of this program called Hack the Gates, Radically Reimagining Admissions. We want to share just a little bit about the project, Hack the Gates, before we get started with our fantastic panel tonight to talk about the Idaho Direct Admissions Program. Hack the Gates is, oh goodness, how do I do that? There we go. Hack the Gates is hosted by Accept and the Rise Center, and we're sponsored with them, the generosity of the Joyce Foundation, and in partnership with the Common Application and Reach Higher, who have all been fantastic partners with us in exploring new ways to approach admissions and that path to college. And we appreciate them so much. So let's give you a little update and just a little history about Hack the Gates. So that magical moment in March of almost a year ago when Lori Laughlin and others were arrested that we lovingly call Operation Varsity Blues occurred. And that evening, as the story was unfolding, Oyan texted me and said, hey, do people in admissions ever talk about how to really rethink this differently from top to bottom? And that night started a conversation, which led to a conversation with the Joyce Foundation, which led to this year-long project. And so the project of Hack the Gates is approaching this radical redesign of admissions through a couple of ways. First, we're starting with building a community, and we hope that folks on Facebook can see us now. We're part of that community of folks who are stakeholders in the process. And we mean that broadly to say, what are some different ways of looking at this? Let's acknowledge the role of college admissions as gatekeepers, and particularly in racialized ways that are really harmful for communities and for our society. How do we look at this and how do we gather people? And so we're building this community online. We're approaching this also through webinars and online community learning. And so this is the third webinar. We hosted several. Here we go. The online community of 1,352 members so far. And one of the highlights is that we have 1,151 active members. And what that means within just the Facebook analytics is that these are folks who seek out this information. They're not just folks who click like on a group and never engage again. They come to the space, they choose to go there, they post, they like, they're engaging. And so to say that we have 1,100 people who are actively participating in this conversation about how to rethink admissions is really cool. This community learning. By the way, I love this weird little thing about PowerPoint that it chooses these icons for you and there's no way to change them. And sometimes they make no sense. So I just wanted to acknowledge I'm using the slide because of this weird little graphic design choice they made. So little winky guy, first one, was a webinar was How Did We Get Here? Where we learned about the history of selective admissions and how that overlaid with some of the important historical moments in our culture and how that resulted in this selective admissions process right now. And had great conversations there. The next webinar was anyone really surprised by Aunt Becky? We looked at those scandals that were hitting the college admissions world in the last year and saying, was any of this new to those who are in the thick of this every day? And if not, why haven't we done anything? And what are some possible interventions? Here we are with webinar 3, exploring Idaho's direct admissions plan. We're going to host several more in the future too. So we've done that, and then we did our big convening in November, and we're really excited to start to share information about this. So Hack the Gates, the convening was a gathering of 105 stakeholders from all around the table. Professionals who engage in admissions on a daily basis, researchers, policymakers, folks from state higher ed, test prep people, independent counselors, we had graduate students, we had people who were engaged and interested in the work. And we learned about equity-centered community design and then use those practices to say, what can we do better here? How do we build some things? Here's some pictures. We started out with the first evening with our guest speakers, the author Paul Tuff and Angel Perez, Dean of Admissions at Trinity College, and Oyan there on stage moderating this great conversation. People were surprised. We had a lot of really great questions. It was a provocative, fast-moving, interesting conversation. I think that was a great kickoff. And then the next day, 105 of us really dug into these ideas and spent the day having challenging and interesting and thought-provoking conversations where we discussed issues of power and issues of hierarchy, issues of finance, so many big picture issues that we carry within ourselves before we even dug into these big ideas. But then acknowledging our places within those systems, how we approach then as a community building out some of these ideas, brainstorming, prototyping, testing. Show some of these pictures because they were just really interesting folks. And then we had a little yoga session because we did a lot of heady things. It was a fantastic and emotional and really exciting day that just jogged a lot of memories. And again, I think built a lot of great community. One of the things I'm incredibly proud of in terms of this group of folks who came together is it was really thoughtfully chosen. And one of my biggest pet peeves in admissions in our world is when folks seem to equate diversity with lack of excellence, or that diversity means you can't have excellence, as they give or take. And I find that incredibly frustrating, as we know, wrong. And so for the participants in Hack the Gates, we gathered 105 experts, people who brought a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience. And of those 105, 66% were people of color. With the research team and with the folks that we were working with who are going to produce some papers later, not only are they people of color, but they tend to be younger and early in the career. And we want to help folks get those names out there and do that work together. But we were able to build this community for a small number of folks who came from such a wide variety of places. And we did it without making a single sacrifice. And that's what I hope sets the tone for admissions, that this is not an and or, this is something that we have to do together. And just wonderful folks there participating too. So then what's next with this, what's happening now? We have a great group of policy papers that will be coming out and that we'll talk about later. We're furthering the series of webinars that we're doing as the policy papers come out. And then in the spring, we're going to host a number of meetups at a variety of professional conferences around the country, starting in March and going through July, where we're going to share some of these ideas and ask people who are, again, wide range of stakeholders to come together and poke holes. And how do these ideas play out? And what are some of the practical issues? And are these things worth prodding further? And if nothing else, just starting the conversation. This is part of the Hack the Gates team. We had a really great time together in DC. And I went for the picture today, just made me smile so much. Of course, keep in touch with us with Hack, and we're really excited about these wonderful opportunities to continue this work. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to not share my screen anymore. There we go. I'm going to hand this over to Oyan now. As we expand the Hack the Gates family in the morning, I wanted to do a quick introduction as we start this. I was lucky enough to be invited to a program at University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana to learn about the direct admissions program, and want to just acknowledge and thank the Joyce Foundation for including me and participating in that. And the team here who's presenting, it was an eye-opening day, and one I was really thrilled to be a part of. And immediately said, "Oyan, we have to figure out how we can include these ideas, if nothing else, just to start the conversation." So thanks everyone. We look forward to taking your questions later. And Oyan, see.
Yep, thanks. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is the third webinar. We anticipate having at least one more sometime this spring. As Marie mentioned, we have several researchers who are working right now to draft policy briefs, including Dr. Jennifer Delaney and Taylor here, who are going to talk a little bit about their work on direct admissions. So without further ado, I just want to give some logistical reminders. If you have any questions or remarks that you'd like to share, if you hover your cursor to the bottom of your screen in Zoom, there is a Q&A box. Please go ahead and post your questions there. And Marie and I will moderate it so that after the presentations of information, we'll moderate a Q&A and folks can participate there on Zoom. If you're over on Facebook, in the Accept group or in the Hack the Gates Facebook group, go ahead and post your questions in the comments section. And Marie and I, again, will take those questions and we'll speak them into being, into the conversation here in the webinar video interface, so to speak. I don't know, losing my words today. Anyway, without further ado, I want to introduce our wonderful panelists today, going in the order of how they'll be discussing and sharing about their work. First is Chuck Staben. He served as president of the University of Idaho from 2014 to 2019. Under his leadership, the state of Idaho instituted a novel direct admission process to facilitate college going, and through work he initiated with the governor, board, and legislature, helped increase need-based financial aid for all Idaho students by 50%. During his tenure, the university achieved new highs in student retention and graduation, a 25% increase in extramural research funding, and record fundraising. Dr. Staben's innovation was recognized by membership on the American Council on Competitiveness, and prior to serving as president at the University of Idaho, Dr. Staben was provost at the University of South Dakota from 2009 to 2014. Welcome, Dr. Staben. Thanks for being here. Jennifer Delaney is an associate professor of higher education in the Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she is also director of the Forum on the Future of Public Education. Dr. Delaney's research focuses on higher education policy with an emphasis on finance. Previously, she worked for the Advisory Committee on Student Financial Assistance, the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education, and served as a consultant for the Commission on the Future of Higher Education, and was an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Thanks for being here, Dr. Delaney. And with her, we have Taylor Odle. First one, second one, first one. Odle. Thank you. These are things I should have worked out before we broadcast, but thank you for your patience with me, Taylor. Taylor is a PhD student in higher education and a master's candidate in statistics at the Wharton School at the university. He's a PhD student in higher education at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, where he employs quantitative methods to study the relationships between state policies and student outcomes, including promise programs, tuition control measures, performance funding, and issues on college access. Before coming to Penn, Taylor served the Tennessee Higher Ed Commission for 3 years in fiscal policy and research positions, principally working on Tennessee's outcomes-based funding formula, tuition and fee policy, governance, and strategic initiatives. Thanks for being here, Taylor. And last but not least, I'm really excited that we have Dr. Dominique Baker with us, who will be offering insights and discussant remarks after our panelists share their expertise. Dr. Baker is an assistant professor of education policy at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Her research focuses on the way that education policy affects and shapes the access and success of underrepresented students in higher education. She primarily investigates student financial aid, affirmative action, and admissions policies, and policies that influence the ability to create an inclusive and equitable campus climate. She earned a PhD from Vanderbilt University and her master's and bachelor's degrees from the University of Virginia. She's currently a visiting scholar at the Stanford University Graduate School of Education. And fun fact, she was also in a previous life assistant dean of admissions, focusing on low income and first generation students at the University of Virginia. So we're bridging the research and the practice here today, clearly in leadership. So thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I just want to hand it over to Dr. Staben to share about Idaho's journey into direct admission.
Thank you very much, Oyan, and Marie for the invitation and the opportunity to do this. I'll, if it's all right, share my screen, and I think we can get the PowerPoint slides going. It may take me just a moment. I think I've done this before. So I'll tell you a little bit about the direct admissions process, how it came to be, and I think Jennifer and Taylor will tell you a lot more about sort of some of the outcomes and their analysis of its impact. Give you a little bit of background about Idaho, if I may. Idaho is it's a relatively small state in terms of population. It is a low income state. It's a low education attainment state. It's a low investment in education sort of state. And you see some of the current figures about Idaho here. One that I want to point out is that I'm just comparing Idaho to the US averages. Idaho has one of the lowest post-secondary progression rates in the nation. This may be a slightly outdated number, but by progression, what I mean is the sort of IPEDS or NCES statistics within 16 months, how many high school graduates go on to enter some form of post-secondary education. We also have relatively low graduation rates and relatively low, therefore, educational attainment rates. When I became president at the University of Idaho in 2014, one of the key initiatives I felt for the entire state was to increase this sort of progression rate and increase the number of college graduates in Idaho. And frankly, from a more self-serving perspective, to increase the number of students who came to the University of Idaho, because all of our institutions are becoming more tuition dependent and we need to have more students to pay that tuition. And frankly, we also need to have more students to have the political impact in a state to say, we are doing a good job for the state. We are having an impact. We're producing the outcomes that state legislators, governors, et cetera, want to have. So that was the rationale for some of this. Idaho is a fairly simple state, especially compared to some of the larger states in terms of population, like Illinois. We have basically four-year institutions. The University of Idaho, Boise State University, Idaho State University are all very modestly selective. The University of Idaho is the primary research institution. Boise State University is the largest public. These are public institutions. There's also a very large private, BYU Idaho. But Boise State University is the largest in terms of population. By modestly selective, what I mean is we actually admit 82%. We're the most selective of all the institutions in Idaho, and we admit 82% of all students who apply, 94% of all who actually complete an application among state residents. Lewis and Clark State College is a four-year college that's open admission, and there are four kind of directional community colleges that have always been open admissions: College of Western Idaho, Southern Idaho, Eastern Idaho Community College, and Northern Idaho Community College. So the idea for direct admit was incredibly simple. And it was that as president, I decided I should apply to my own university and see how hard that was to do. So I got a free half hour or so and sat in my office and was timing myself on how long it took to apply, because I thought, well, I just want to see that this is an easy process for students and others. And it wasn't. It wasn't easy for me to apply, and I'm actually pretty good at filling out web forms. And so I'm sitting in the office trying to think about this information, of course, making up some bits of information as I go along. And we asked questions that were kind of irrelevant, I thought, to the whole process, and all kinds of other aspects of this. And the web form itself was just terrible. But as I was doing this, I was realizing that in Idaho, we have a unique governance situation. We have one K-20 board that controls all public education in the state. So formally, all public schools, universities, K-12, et cetera, are under the same governance structure. And we actually have a fairly decent longitudinal student longitudinal data system. So we have the K-12 data on essentially all students. In addition to which, interestingly, Idaho sponsors students to take one standardized exam, ACT or SAT. And so we have nearly universal test scores on Idaho students as well, all in that database. And I was thinking to myself as I was trying to put these information into our terrible application, why do I have to do this? Doesn't the state board, and therefore I, have access to all the information for the most part that I would ever want a student to provide, like their GPA, the courses they've taken, their SAT score, and some of those kinds of things. Now, there might be other information I'd want from a student. You know, there might be financial information, et cetera, but fundamentally, to make the admissions decision, particularly to a very modestly selective institution, it seemed to me we have all the information that we needed. So I got this idea actually basically right around New Year's. I started in February, I guess it was in the fall, excuse me. I started in February of 2014, and I had this idea in the fall of 2014. And I started talking to people about it. We have an active group called Idaho Business for Education. I started talking to the state board office, and I said, why couldn't we just take the information we have and admit all of the students that we want to admit to the various institutions? And frankly, I never got well, we couldn't do that because of X. Well, we could do that. And so why don't we do that? Is there a downside to doing that? And I frankly didn't see a downside. And I will point out at this time, there was also a lot of negative messaging about college in Idaho. It was actually an effort to encourage students to go to college. There was a private foundation, the Albertsons Foundation, that was funding commercials that were playing quite a lot that were "Don't Fail Idaho." And it was actually, it struck me and certainly the teachers in the state as extremely negative sort of messaging, because it would have this school bus pulling up to a very lonely spot in Idaho and the kids getting off, and then the voiceover would be sort of like, you know, 8 out of 10 students will never graduate from college in Idaho and like that. And so I also felt that some kind of messaging that was more positive and switched sort of the student and family default idea from, well, I guess we're not going to go to college, to no, you're in college, go, just do the next thing. And so that was the idea. By the spring of 2015, we'd actually presented the state board, presented to the President's Council, the group of 8 presidents who are higher education presidents first, and then the state board. And I said, well, why don't we do this? And essentially they said, yes, we're going to do it. And so we just did it. Now, there were some things we didn't do quite right in terms of implementation. We didn't talk very much to guidance counselors of high schools. We didn't do a lot of those kinds of things. So when students got this letter that said, you're admitted to these institutions, it was probably pretty puzzling, and especially the guidance counselors were a little unsure. We also all still had our applications. So a student that was admitted actually still had to apply, which was kind of weird. And so there were a number of aspects to smoothing this process out that we probably rushed the process too much through in order to be really thoughtful. What you'll see is that we've evolved that process over the last couple of years. And I think now the process itself is much smoother, and perhaps that will facilitate the actual use of that whole process. And we may see some additional positive effects of the process. So, that was it. This was remarkably easy to do in a state like Idaho. 1 K-20 board, limited number of institutions, modest selectivity, et cetera. Now, I will admit that when I thought about this process, I did not think about inclusion, and I agree with you both that inclusion is an important aspect of admissions. I did think this will probably benefit lower income first generation students as much or more than anybody else, and so there probably will be an inclusionary effect, but I didn't think explicitly about that, and I think that's something that we need to think about. So the way this works is you're in. If you meet the selective criteria for those 3 selective, modestly selective programs, then you get a letter that says you're in all 8 of Idaho's post-secondary institutions. And if you don't meet those, you're admitted to the 6 open admission programs that are available. As I said, we could have coordinated this better with the universities, with the guidance counselors, more effective communication with families, et cetera. One of the problems was that you still had to give us your information. And the reason for this is not a particularly good one. It was that our state board simply didn't want to provide the universities information about the K-12 students who are graduating. So we still had to, we literally didn't know who was admitted, and we literally didn't know anything about them. So we at the University of Idaho fairly rapidly changed our application for state residence to a process your admission. By the way, the next year, and we still charged you for that, and the next year we actually made some changes there as well. So, and we can talk a little bit more about that. So the next year we eliminated any kind of application processing fee, et cetera. I think I'll say something more about that. We actually have seen a slight decrease in progression rates, very slight, but an increase in the number of our students, Idaho high school students who come to Idaho institutions. We did have a positive message out there. We now have a clearer process and clearer communication in place. And I think we also have clearer communication about what it takes to get into the selective programs in Idaho. That letter actually is pretty clear. We did a lot of surveying after that first year, and students responded that they, 22% said they were more likely to attend college than had they not received that letter. The open response questions, I think, were the more interesting. This changed my life. I did not know I was college material, and today I'm a freshman at the University of Idaho was actually a fairly typical kind of response. The effect of this seems to increase with decreasing parental education and decreasing income, as I had actually anticipated. As I said, we did take easy steps to improve our process. We now have very facile web student data entry. Essentially, students can go in on a form and just click, I want to apply to I want my admission at these places to be fully processed, and now these institutions all have all of my student record data. There's free processing at 7 of Idaho's 8 institutions. Boise State University still charges to process their admission. We've also added something for all of our students, actually, which is what's called durable admission. At the U of I, University of Idaho, I should say, admission is good for at least 3 years by default. A lot of our students will go on missions. We have a high Mormon population, et cetera, so we changed some other things too. There are other ways I think the state needed to think about increasing attainment. Taylor's probably much more expert in the effects of some of these sorts of things than I. We need to enhance our FAFSA completion. It's one of the lowest rates in the nation. Costs and aid are a big issue for our students. We know this. I was pleased that last year, with the governor's help, we managed to increase need-based aid by 50%. Before doing that, students, Idaho's program was a mixture of need and merit, and only students with a GPA over 3.7 could possibly have been eligible for need-based aid, which is a pretty small segment of the population, actually. We need to change recruitment, retention, graduation, and return adults to education to raise attainment, but that would be subject for another webinar. So I always like to at least stimulate you thinking about what other access and attainment ideas should we be considering. Maybe this is more consistent with Hack the Gates than direct admissions per se, but what is the role of dual credit? Idaho's made a $20 million a year investment in dual credit. Have we actually seen more students as a result of that? There's all the talk about last dollar and free tuition and student loan forgiveness, income share agreements, as we've seen at Purdue. And I've been working with a company that called the Education Insurance Company that actually offers or is trying to originate something called American Dream Insurance to ensure the post-graduation incomes of our graduates. I think we need to think about the entire context of admission and retention sorts of programs to ensure that people have access and can succeed in higher education. And the reason we do this is one of my favorite slides, it may not mean much to you, is to ensure that Idahoans have access to education. On my left is a picture, high school age guy named Tom Mueller. He's from a family of loggers. He's the only person in his family, in a large family, ever to attend college. This is Tom as a logger. This is Tom as the inventor of the rocket engine that powers SpaceX. Returnable engines. He's the chief engineer and co-founder of SpaceX. And he, in high school, was in a geometry class, and the teacher asked him, Tom, what do you want to be? And he said, I want to be an aircraft mechanic. And the teacher said, Tom, do you want to fix the airplanes or do you want to design them? And Tom said, well, it'd be cool to design them, but how would you ever get to do that? Well, you'd go 40 miles down the road to the University of Idaho and get a mechanical engineering degree. And Tom did that, and now he's invented reusable rockets, which is kind of an extraordinary thing. And I wonder how many other Tom Muellers there are out there in Idaho or in your state, and how we can help them find college, make it as easy as possible for them to go and to succeed once they get there. I hope I haven't gone over or too drastically under my time, but thanks for the opportunity to address you today.
Thank you, Chuck. It's really informative. And so now, you know, in Hack the Gates style, we have research practice partnership. And so on the research side of this project, I'm really excited that we have Jennifer and Taylor here who will share some of their analysis and research on this program with you all.
Great. So I'm Jennifer Delaney. I'm from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I'm going to talk a bit about some research that Taylor and I have done in conjunction with some other folks in our research team, including Manuel Gonzalez-Concha, who's Taylor's advisor at the University of Pennsylvania and an associate professor there. So I want to thank Unyan and Marie for having us out, and also Dr. Staben for setting us up so well for thinking and talking about direct admissions. See if I can get this. I don't know how to, oh, okay, good. So I know Dr. Staben went through some of the elements of direct admissions. I put a slide together just so I would remember to talk through everything. So I'll go through this kind of quickly. But one of the things that really makes direct admissions, or in some states it's called proactive admissions, really different than the way in which we do admissions historically in the US is that it is proactively pushing information to students. And that information goes directly to students. So it is not students going forth and seeking and searching and getting confused and having all sorts of inequities based on social and cultural capital for students to figure out where the places they want to write to apply to. This is rather the state saying, hey, we've already got your information. We know where you can go to college, and we're going to send you a letter that tells you, congratulations, you've gotten in. And as Dr. Staben said, in Idaho, they use one threshold. So for selective institutions, you get admitted to all the public institutions in the state. The state of Idaho added 2 private institutions as well, so really increasing college choice for students in this process. And if you weren't above the threshold, you were admitted to 6 institutions in the state that included 2 four-year options. So every student in the state of Idaho has the opportunity to access a baccalaureate degree. It also included all of the community colleges in the state. It is a relatively low cost and sort of a nice technical solution for thinking about inequities in college access. And it is used, it's using state longitudinal data systems, data that's already collected on students. We already know students' GPAs, and in Idaho, where there's a required high school exit exam, we know their standardized test scores. Asking each and every student to go and fill this information out over and over again to apply to different institutions is kind of crazy, because in 2020, we actually have this information already on students. We think it's important that there are these tiers where every single high school leaver in the state has the opportunity to access some type of post-secondary setting, and using direct admissions to help open access institutions, both on the institutional side to bolster their enrollment, and also on the college access side to tell students that you actually you've been admitted already, you're already in, you have these opportunities to go to college. Can be just absolutely life-changing for students. And I'll go through some of the results from Idaho, but it's working on every single margin along the ability spectrum. So kids who wouldn't have thought they were college material are getting letters saying, yes, you're in and you can go to college. Kids who would have gone to community colleges are getting pushed into 4 years. Kids who would have gone to less selective institutions are getting pushed into more selective. And then also kids who would have left the state are staying in state because they've got a sure thing that they've been proactively already admitted to college. We think that a universal policy like this, where everyone in the state is admitted, just has incredible potential for increasing college access, but also reducing equity gaps, and really sort of flipping the script on how admissions is done, where students get the information that they need and they don't have to navigate a complicated system that adults have put together. Instead, that information shows up on their doorstep or in their mailbox, in their email box, to know where they've been admitted. So reducing these transactional frictions in the college admissions process, in the case of direct admissions, but also in other settings, has been shown to be amazingly important for kids to actually go to college. It's sort of crazy to us as researchers to think, oh, you got stumped on one question on an admissions form, and that's the difference between going to college or not. But we know from research that happens, and happens a lot in this country. And something like direct admissions, where students are proactively push that information, can really ease those frictions. In terms of a policy perspective, from the state level, from the higher education governing board level, even from the institutional level, this is an incredibly low cost policy. If we compare it to other things like mentoring programs, or having students get help filling out college applications, or hiring more high school guidance counselors, right? The cost of this program is using a state data system that already exists. And then if there are paper letters, it's the cost of postage for sending out the proactive letters. In Idaho and the other states that have direct admissions, so currently right now there are a few states that will be coming online in the fall, but South Dakota is the other state that is actively running direct admissions right now. But there are multiple notifications to multiple groups of individuals. So it's not just the students who receive information on direct admissions, but it's also their parents and schools. This seems very important, that there are trusted adults in a student's life who also know where they've been admitted to school. And there's multiple mailings. Like, you're gonna get a letter, you've got a letter, you get a reminder that you have a letter. And then admissions becomes going to claim your spot, right? So you've already been admitted. You're just saying, in Idaho, yes, I want to go to the University of Idaho, and moving that forward. In South Dakota, they've got a December 1 deadline on that. So all of this is sort of wrapped up earlier in an admissions process, whereby sort of the end of the year, senior year, students know where they're going and they've claimed their spots. This is a graphic that Taylor nicely put together about kind of how we make the decisions. This is using Idaho as an example. It's a little complicated on the threshold where it's a combination of both high school GPA and standardized test scores. Right now, Idaho has a state contract with the SAT. So most students in Idaho are taking the SAT, although as Dr. Staben said, they could take either SAT or ACT. But this is how, students, if they're over a 3.0 GPA, if they've got 12 credits of high school, if their combined GPA SAT scores are high enough, they get that group of 8 letter where they're admitted to every institution in the state. Otherwise, they're getting the group of 6 letter. So according to some folks at the Idaho State Board of Education, their goals really were to increase a college going culture in the state, to connect students and families to information earlier. We know from research that early information and an early commitment is really important to changing students' decisions about that question of should I go to college or not, and also the question of where should I enroll. And it's intended to ease that transition in moving from high school to college, and also just to proactively show students that they have access to college. So our point of view as researchers is this program is doing a great job of meeting the goals that the state set out for it. In terms of reported results out of Idaho, this is from the Idaho State Board of Education. It's an 88% increase in applications. So in this case, applications means that form where you go and claim your spot, that as Dr. Staben said, this has been greatly simplified because they're already importing information from the state longitudinal data system. Almost 7% increase in students immediately enrolling in college after high school, a 3% increase in enrollment, a 1 percentage point increase in the college going rate, and also directing more students who would have gone out of state to stay into state. And that's about a 3% increase in students staying in state for college. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to, oh no, wait, I've got one more good slide. So as we thought through this, what is it about direct admissions that's really working on a policy level? So this is sort of increasing order of effectiveness as we move along the arrow for students. So one is having a common application. We see this across states and across university systems. There are some systems like the one in Wisconsin where it's sort of a clearinghouse style common application. There are other systems that have a single application where it's the same questions for every institution, right? Again, that's easing the transactional costs for students to have something simple and a common application. As the University of Idaho went, and 8 of the 9 institutions in Idaho have gone to eliminate admissions fees up front, so no one is paying for admissions fees to be able to fill out an application. That seems to matter and is sort of even more effective than just having a common application. The red arrow points to proactive admissions or direct admissions, the policy we're talking about today, where we have early admissions, that information is pushed to students, and it's a commitment, it's a guarantee of admissions. We think going forward, other states, as they think about putting this in or think about adapting policy, Dr. Staben sort of foreshadowed some of this as well, but if we can add student financial aid information, or even better, add a guarantee of student financial aid information to direct admissions, it will be even more powerful. So for students to get not only you're admitted, you have a spot to attend college, but here's how you can pay for it. And here's perhaps a state level need-based grant scholarship that you can use to pay for college, can really be life-changing in terms of students having the information they need to make informed decisions about their college choice process, and hopefully ultimately enrolling in college. So now with that, I will turn it over to Taylor so you can talk through what we did on our research project.
Thanks, Jennifer. So thanks to some generous support from the Joyce Foundation and our great program officer, we undertook this project in partnership to kind of look at 2 goals. And one was to evaluate what happened in Idaho after this policy was implemented. And we were asking what happened based on 2 outcomes. One, did colleges in Idaho that were a part of this direct admission system, did they receive more applications from schools, from students in high schools in Idaho and from schools, high schools outside of Idaho? But we're also looking at enrollment, right? So the idea of direct admissions is to potentially increase enrollment of students across a variety of groups. And so we're looking at enrollment at all, at the statewide level and at institutions, but also across racial, socioeconomic, and geographic contexts. Again, to see if we're able to target some equity considerations or some considerations of Pell eligible or non-Pell eligible students, and also if we're able to move the margins of students enrolling from in-state or out of state as well. The second part of our project was to look at, again, with the Joyce Foundation's like regional focus and Jennifer being in Illinois, we were looking at, is this potentially a translatable policy that could happen in the Great Lakes or Midwestern states? And so we used some forecasting procedures to take what we learned from Idaho and to apply it to those regions so they could have some rough estimates of what they could potentially expect. Because as you can imagine, a state like Illinois or a city like Chicago is very different than the state of Idaho or regions there. And so those are kind of the two goals of the project. And so, like I said, as Jennifer covered, we saw some really good and some great news coming out of Idaho. So this is very promising policy that increased college going rate, reduced out-of-state attrition. And so that kind of fueled our interest in pursuing this project and asking these very specific questions on applications and enrollment. But again, given the fact that we'd like to answer this question, did direct admissions do this, right? It's possible that Idaho's, FTE or enrollment numbers were going up anyways, or that they were going to go down without direct admissions, or, X, Y, or Z could have happened. And so we use two specific causal inference or quasi-experimental methods to kind of approximate, well, what would have happened in Idaho had they not done direct admissions? And that helps us understand, what was the effect of direct admissions on these two outcomes of interest. Importantly, though, we're also able to control for a lot of these other factors that are going on. So as you can imagine, unemployment in a state may affect students' college-going behaviors or enrollment at institutions. And so both of these methods are able to help us do that. And so the first one that we actually use is called difference in differences. And we're showing this kind of just to show the intuition behind it as well. So what we do is we actually compare Idaho to other states before they enacted direct admission, and then we compare Idaho to other states after they enacted direct admission. And that helps us give us a baseline of what I mentioned before of, well, what would have happened in Idaho had they not developed this direct admission system? And so you can kind of think of this as, well, maybe Idaho's enrollment was always 2,000 or 1,000 students more than other states. And so over time, if it's consistently that average is always 1,000 students more, then after direct admissions, it's now 3,000 students more. So then the idea there is like, oh, well, maybe direct admissions was associated with that 2,000, FTE increase. And so the first, we look at direct admissions and we look at difference in differences, and we apply this model across state and institutional contexts. So the state level, we're looking at really aggregated FTE enrollment numbers across all the institutions, and then applications submitted in aggregate to all of those institutions. At the institutional level, we're actually able to ask a little more granular questions. We look at undergraduate enrollment overall at the institutional level, as well as those three kind of enrollment contexts. Are more in-state students enrolling, are more Pell eligible students enrolling, and are more students from potentially underrepresented racial minority groups enrolling as well. And here, given the granularity of the data that we were able to work with, and also the demography of the state of Idaho, here racial minority it comprises all students that are not in the white racial group within the state, just given kind of the small counts as well. So the second method that we use is very similar to difference in differences, but it's called the generalized synthetic control method. And what synthetic control does is instead of picking a set of other states to compare Idaho to before to say, oh, it's 1,000 students more over time, a helpful way to think about this is kind of constructing a Frankenstein Idaho. And so what we do is we take little pieces of all of these observable things about other states and we weight them so that the state, a synthetic state, looks just like Idaho before they enacted direct admissions. And so we're able to show that basically the differences before the policy happened are meaningless under this weighted, universe. And so then once direct admissions does happen, we estimate those differences. If that 2,000 student difference still exists, then we can be reasonably certain under other assumptions that that's due to the policy itself. And so we apply difference in differences and synthetic control across both of these state and institutional outcomes. And so what we find generally is that, and we do find some consistent evidence that difference in differences, or that direct admissions is associated with an increase in FTE in the state, and it may also affect some of those enrollment contexts. And so what we generally see is about an 11.3% in statewide FTE enrollment, And again, this is aggregated across all institutions. And so at the institutional level, you'll see that that enrollment is about 930 students per campus, also still about that 11%. We don't, however, find at the state level or aggregated level, we don't find any effects on applications. And so the idea could be like, well, whatever is considered an application and the data that we're able to see may not be the type of application that students are now submitting under the direct admission system. If enrollment is going up, we would certainly expect that there are more applications, coming into the institution. And so those are likely driven by some definitional differences, but things we'd like to further explore as well. Importantly, though, at the institutional level, we do see increases of undergraduate students, undergraduate enrollment, again, about 930 per campus. And there also seems to be a shift within the mix of students who are enrolling at these institutions. And so we see a per campus increase of about 100 students in that undergraduate cohort, of about 100 more students coming from in-state regions rather than out of state. Importantly, though, we don't find any effects on the percentage of students who, in those entering cohorts, who are Pell eligible, which is our current proxy for are they considered low income, or students from racial minority groups. And so that was our diff and diff method. And synthetic control, very similar again, but kind of provides that consistent evidence that we do see an in-state increase of undergraduate students at the campus level, at this level of about 150 students. And again, that's per campus. So the University of Idaho, Boise State, each was approximately receiving another 150 in-state students. So as I mentioned before, taking these percentage point increases and applying them to some other states in the Great Lakes or Midwestern region, what we see is, so if you look at that first graph, you see kind of Idaho, that FTE increase at the aggregated level was 11.32%. And so we just want to put that in perspective of what an 11.32% increase would be for the Great Lakes states or for in Illinois. So in Illinois, if they realized a very similar effect as was observed in Idaho, there could be approximately 42,000 more students enrolling in higher education across their institutions. And similarly, what that could mean for Illinois, again, at that per institution level would be an increase of over 900 students per campus and between 100 and 200 students coming from in-state regions. And Jennifer will also point you to some of the reports that came from this research that kind of tell a little bit more about the sophisticated forecasting that we do. But this was helpful for us to frame these findings in the context of some other states as well. So overall, again, we see the direct admissions may be associated with these large increases in state full-time equivalent enrollment, as well as at the institutional level, enrollment of undergraduates, and particularly those coming from in-state. As Jennifer mentioned too, we do see this as a promising low-cost mechanism to increase college enrollment, given that at the time of this evaluation, there was kind of the cost of postage to identify, to send students to let them know that they were being admitted to college, and that even then we still do see some increases in enrollment. Again, we believe that this is transferable to other states given this kind of administrative ability to implement the policy. But again, some potential mechanisms to focus on and potentially some additional areas of policy innovation could be around moving the racial socioeconomic enrollment groups or socioeconomic context for this enrollment outcome.
So we're going to share just a little sort of qualitative responses. I know Dr. Staben started with this a little as well, but these are both were collected from students in Idaho, where the State Board of Education did a survey of students, and then the ones at the bottom in red were some surveys and focus groups that a advocacy group called Young Invincibles did in Illinois here about the idea of direct admissions. And consistently we're hearing from students, I really didn't think any college would accept me, but I was wrong. I wish someone had told me I'd have options. This proactive pushing information to students seems to be really, really valuable, and it's putting students who don't behave like wealthy white individuals, right? So either minoritized students, low-income students, students at low-resource high schools, it's putting them on a level playing field, right? You get the same information, you know your college choice set in a way that students haven't known in the past. and that shows up in your mailbox, that's actively pushed to you. And we think it's got great potential for changing student behavior and really helping direct students to their best options for post-secondary study. So as we wrapped up the research, we wanted to think about some policy recommendations around this. Our focus on sort of access and equity was at the state level, but we really think that other states should consider direct admissions policies. They seem to be effective. They're low cost, especially for states that have already developed state longitudinal data systems, which most states have at this point in time. And it can just be immensely helpful. And on the student individual end, it can be absolutely life-changing. We think that related policies, such as the use of a common application system, also need to be considered. Even if you can't fully get to direct admissions, we've got some related research that shows that just using a common application can also help to increase enrollments. Anything that's easing the friction of the college search and college choice process seems to be very valuable for leveling that playing field. Anything that's universal and impacts students in this, it's the same regardless of their background, also seems to be really impactful in terms of shifting students' enrollment decisions for college. We do think it's very important to maintain a focus on low-income and racial minority students as we think about these policies, and to make sure that they're not disadvantaged in a system, but also to be actively creating a system that makes sure that everyone has the same information and the same ability to access college. We also, I know it's a little self-serving, but we do think it's important to partner with researchers and policy organizations in thinking through the design of different systems, and that research and doing evidence-based work on this will help improve what we're doing in terms of direct admissions and other admissions policies in the US. So Taylor referenced this a little earlier, but we ran a conference in December at the University of Illinois. Marie also mentioned that in her opening remarks. But at that time, we released 3 related reports about direct admissions. The appendix on the full report has all sorts of good information on the data and methods we used. So we're happy to direct you to that website with our reports. If you want to check out what Idaho is doing in terms of their common application, we've got that URL listed. We also had the privilege of having Carson Howell out to talk about this. He wrote his dissertation on Idaho's direct admissions policy, so there's some wonderful work in there. And then we've got some press coverage of Idaho's policy as well. So I'll just put up our contact information. We're happy to reach out to folks as well. We're hoping to continue our work in this area and to partner with more states and systems and thinking about the development of direct admissions, and also creative ways that we can evaluate and help foster equity and access through the use of those systems. So with that, I turn it back to Oyan.
Thank you so much. Lots of great information there. And last but not least, we have Dr. Dominique Baker, who will share some remarks and hopefully provoke some more questions from the audience. Just a reminder, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. If you're participating with us via Zoom or on Facebook, go ahead and post a question there in the comment section. So Dominique.
Awesome. So thanks again, everyone, for letting us come and have this fun conversation. And thanks definitely to Taylor and Jen, because I got a chance to actually read through the report. And so I highly recommend that if you're interested in this, checking out the website is really great, because there's a lot more interesting nuggets you can dive into. So I have sort of 2 orienting questions that I want us to potentially think about. But before I get to that, when we're thinking about this policy and its potential to transfer to other states, I think that we've sort of heard from multiple people today, but sort of 2 primary things have to be in place. One, we have to have a sort of higher education infrastructure such that, and this is, I'll say, I guess, this is with an assumption, right, that one of the major things is we have a state longitudinal data system. Without a state longitudinal data system, it becomes really hard for colleges and universities to know what's going on in the high schools, to know how to select students to provide information to. Okay, so beyond that, a state needs to have sort of a similar higher education profile in selectivity. So sort of several people have said it today, that Idaho has institutions that are moderately selective and then open access institutions. And so one of the things that any other state that would be interested in becomes more tricky is the more highly selective institutions that a state has, questions become, right, sort of, where do we set our thresholds for what automatic admission to the selective institution looks like? How do we sort of conceptualize and think about that? So I think that's a sort of critical part to the policy transferability between states. And the second part is this piece where Idaho is great. It mandates and then pays for students to take some sort of college entrance exam. There are a number of states that do not do this, that students are required to find the funding. And yes, there are fee waivers that students have access to, but I'm sure most of us know in my former life, when I was trying to help students better understand this, it can be an onerous process, sort of those frictions that were mentioned earlier, to try to get fee waivers when taking the SAT or the ACT. And so because of that, Idaho has helped make it more possible that all students have an opportunity to take these tests. And so I think a critical thing that we want to keep in mind as we frame the discussion is when we think about other states doing this, what happens if another state doesn't have the same type of higher education sort of ecosystem that we're thinking about? And what happens if the school system doesn't pay for testing? That we could have some serious inequities sort of built into that type of system, even if we have direct admissions. So those are two things that I wanted to highlight that Idaho is doing to sort of help with this process. Okay, now having said that, my sort of charge is for us to think, to have provocative thoughts around what equity looks like with this. And so my first question that I want us to think about is from the research that we just heard about, we're not seeing as much, we're seeing sort of overall effects for, in particular, in-state students enrollment. We're not seeing as much when it comes to our Pell eligible students or our students of color. And so my big question with that I've been sort of noodling over is why? What do we think is happening here that is creating this scenario? Because I agree that there could be potential for closing equity gaps with this type of policy. We don't necessarily seem to be seeing at the early stage, right? Like it may be as the program matures, but at this early stage, we're not necessarily seeing evidence of that. And I actually think this is a sort of perfect space for where future research, potentially thinking about qualitative work, talking to the students about how this shifted their thoughts or didn't shift their thoughts. Because one of the things I do wonder about is whether or not the sort of, we talked about the fact that need-based aid was drastically increased very recently, but we don't know how much effect that was able to have on the effects estimates that the research was studying. And so what happens if you have a certain, what happens if your family can afford $500 in order to go to college, and one day you had to fill out an onerous application and the next day you were directly admitted? You still only have $500 to go to college, right? And so there's potential that those types of barriers can matter just as much as the application barriers that we're talking about. Another piece we sort of haven't talked as much about that still goes along with this line of sort of why are we not seeing those effects for students of color or Pell eligible students is around this idea that we sometimes take for granted that as long as a student is admitted to a certain institution, they'll definitely want to go there. And we know from a lot of research on the climate within a campus, the environment within a campus, that sense of belongingness can matter a lot about whether or not students choose to go to college period or which college they choose to go to. And so this is much more difficult, right, to sort of think about from a quantitative perspective. But I want us to push on thinking if we have spaces that are potentially not as welcoming to certain students, and then we make it easier for those students to be admitted, but we didn't necessarily change how welcoming that environment was, do we necessarily expect to see enrollment shifts? So those are some things to think about on the front end side. And then I want us to also think about on the second part, you all had a really great figure to sort of show how students are admitted to all 8 institutions versus the 6 more open access institutions. And one of the things that actually, for the reason this resonated a lot with me, is I'm currently doing research with Michael Bastido, who is a professor at the University of Michigan. And we are looking at what a simulation of a national sort of admissions lottery would look like. If we created an admissions lottery across the United States, sort of what do we think we would see happening here? And there have been a couple of studies that have done this previously. And one of the things that we're starting to find from our preliminary results is that when you create a national lottery and you sort of say the individuals that enter into this lottery are, they have a certain GPA, or they have a certain college entrance exam score for the SAT or the ACT, or some combination of the two, we actually find that the pools of students do not automatically create the type of economic or racial equity that some might automatically think could happen. And so this, right, can talk about sort of what grading looks like in different high schools. This can talk about potential biases that are built into the tests as well. But sort of we're looking at multiple national data sets where we see that when you create these types of cutoffs and say sort of, well, everyone above it has the opportunity to attend, it doesn't automatically actually create an equitable sort of entering class. And so I think that's an interesting question then when we talk about these selective institutions, that if the bars that we have for the selective institutions are similar to what we're looking at in our study, then I actually wouldn't be shocked that we don't see this sort of closing of equity gaps, because when we create these thresholds around GPA and SAT score, not saying that these cutoffs have anything to do with the actual intellectual merit of students, right? There are a lot of things about like schools as systems and people's lives that go into this sort of numbers that we look at for GPAs and test scores. But having said that, when we just look at these cutoffs, we can often see that the share of Indigenous, Black, and Latinx students are actually smaller than when we use something that's more of a holistic admissions process. And that's at varying degrees. That is including moderately selective institutions, so not just talking about highly selective institutions. So I would challenge us to try to think, when we're talking about the selective institutions, what are the ways that we could potentially create classes of academically prepared students that also can work towards decreasing these sort of equity gaps that we're talking about, because based on a lot of the research that we have and on the research that you all presented today, those don't automatically on their own decrease gaps. So it could be, right, that we think about what does it mean to have an additional policy that specifically focuses on students who are below those cut points that we still think could potentially be academically prepared, that we can evaluate in some holistic manner to think about targeting closing those gaps. So I'll sort of say that broadly, and then due to time, I think I'll sort of stop there because I want to make sure that everyone who's so awesome to tune in gets a chance to sort of ask their questions. So I'll say thank you again for letting me get a chance to comment, and I'm really excited to go from here.
Thank you so much. I think we have a lot of participants who are eager to participate with comments and questions. Marie, have you received any questions on your end? If not, I can offer some questions over here.
Sorry about that, I was on mute. Sorry about that. I'm getting folks telling me that they're typing up their questions right now because they have a lot of thoughts.
Okay,
so pose yours.
Okay, so I really appreciate the comments about, you know, the need to focus on questions of equity. Dominique, your remarks, right? It reminded me of the recent Ed Trust report that race-conscious policies and foci are really the only way to really disrupt racial injustices and equity gaps, right? And so I think that's a really important reminder. And so with that, I know that there is a question about, you know, it sounds like with direct admissions, you know, the application process is essentially just like, here are my documents, right? It's kind of like a verification of like, just submitting the documents to reserve your spot. So the question is about undocumented students. We know that with some documentation processes, like with FAFSA, if the process requires that students immediately submit FAFSA for undocumented students, for example, that becomes very problematic and troubling and dangerous. And so would there be ways to work with, and I appreciate the mentions throughout the presentations about partnering with and working with school counselors to work with various student populations and in the communication process. So has there been thoughts about segments of the population such as undocumented immigrant students in these processes?
Well, Jan, we have thought a little bit about this, Chuck, undocumented students. Idaho doesn't have a very large undocumented population, and the University of Idaho especially doesn't have a large number of such students. As I understand it, the student records of the students in high school, if they are undocumented, are used. They are automatically admitted as if they were not undocumented. The student doesn't actually have to do anything there. Now then, as far as giving us their documents, for all students, including undocumented students, it's a pretty facile process. They log into a Next Steps Idaho website and they sort of click a few boxes. It's almost a consent-like process. We are not collecting financial information at that point. And yet, I do think, so I think up to that point, the students are probably sort of okay. But I think then, as you point out, I think they will meet barriers, particularly in Idaho. They are not eligible for our need-based scholarships, as I understand it, from our state program. And the FAFSA is another barrier. You mentioned that. So I would think undocumented students, at least in Idaho, under current conditions, will face some additional barriers, and that will be difficult. I did want to speak for a moment to the Pell and underrepresented ethnic groups in Idaho. Idaho is a fairly white state, but it has about 12% Hispanic and about 1% indigenous population. It is low income. That is an issue. I'm actually somewhat heartened that we haven't seen a decrease in those populations relative to the projected increase in the other population, in that I think those populations in Idaho are just fundamentally very unlikely to attend college. And there's a pretty large pool of those students who don't have the financial means to attend college. And so just admitting them doesn't solve the problems that Dominique mentioned, that they don't have the means, they may not feel comfortable on campus, et cetera. So the fact that we didn't preferentially encourage sort of middle-class white students to come, we brought everybody sort of equally along, is actually somewhat encouraging to me in this particular setting. Now that could be a bit different in other states. And I'm not saying we've solved a problem, but we haven't created a new problem.
So I appreciate everything Dr. Staben said. I'll add on to that just a little bit as well. So one is I want to point out some of the data limitations that we had because of Idaho's demographics. We as researchers didn't feel that we could report really, really small numbers for some of the especially racial groups that we care about. So in a different state, in a different setting, I think we might see different effects and larger effects just because of the demographics there. And then to address the question about undocumented students, I'll sort of talk about this in a roundabout way. It's not actually an admissions program, but it is sort of a backdoor one. But in Illinois here, the City Colleges of Chicago, which is the community college system within the city, has partnered with Chicago Public Schools to do data sharing. So I think Dominique was absolutely right to talk about these existing data systems, but we do see other partnerships at the sub-state level, be it citywide or with a local high school or private institutions trying to do this, right? So it doesn't just have to be all in at the state level to think about are there equivalents to direct admissions. So the city of Chicago has a promise program. It's called the Chicago Star Scholarship that offers free tuition for 2 years at the community college system. And they've done a data match where they're proactively sending letters to students. It is an open access institution, so students are already admitted, but now they know that they're already admitted because they're receiving the letters. It is sort of a merit element to this, in that you have to be above a certain high school GPA coming out of CPS, but you get a letter saying you have free tuition at Chicago City colleges. And one of the populations where we've seen the largest enrollment growth has been undocumented students. So thinking about direct admissions, perhaps coupling with things like promise programs. I know there's a community college in New York State that is thinking about putting in a promise program along with their direct admission system. But that is a way that we can ease things. And for those at-risk populations that don't have good information, this is a good way of proactively getting information to folks, and perhaps even proactively getting information about available aid when they're not able to participate in federal aid programs.
Thank you.
So we have a question that Chuck touched upon in the chat room, but want to pose broadly. Based on your knowledge and expertise, would you recommend the same program that was rolled out in Idaho to be rolled out in all states? If not, why? If yes, what insights could you give to other states? I'm really curious about the insights, particularly, with this reflection back, what would you, tweak around the edges as well? Thanks.
Marie, just briefly, the answer I gave in the chat room was simply that I think this is relatively easy in states somewhat like Idaho. And I know that doesn't cover much of the population of the United States necessarily, but states like Nevada, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Hawaii, perhaps, a relatively small number of institutions, and also typically not very selective, I'll call them flagship institutions. When you go to a state like Illinois, where you have a very prominent, or Michigan or Wisconsin, where you have a very prominent and selective flagship public, maybe even a second flagship, I think this gets much more difficult for those institutions to participate. I think it's also a little bit more difficult for the students when you have a large number of institutions like in Illinois does have. They just have, many community colleges. They have many. They have the two flagships. Urbana-Champaign and Chicago Circle has reached some sort of flagship-like status, I think, there, and so that's much more difficult. Not necessarily impossible, but I think is going to be much more difficult to implement from a sort of higher ed sociology sort of standpoint, if nothing else.
I think something that I would mention too that Dominique was bringing up, and it's important to note that this isn't a one-size-fits-all policy. And I think what we've seen with states like South Dakota now operates a proactive admission system, is that states should have the flexibility to tailor these policies to meet the needs of their state or their institutions and the students that are within their state, right? So if we know that students are facing a particular barrier with these, through the application process or with accessing need-based financial aid, then this should be a system to ameliorate, as many challenges as possible, rather than to put another, potential barrier in the way for students. And what we've seen, like in South Dakota, like to Dominique's point as well, like I don't believe there is universal testing, and so they're using like a combination of high school GPA and smarter balance scores that the state does pay for. And so ways to get at these, ways to address and to implement these policies that are already existing for the state. And something that I also want to mention, not to go back too many questions, but to note that, as Jennifer said, we're working with some small N's in Idaho specifically. And so what we could, it's very plausible that what we are even seeing in the data, given the 1 or 2 years we're able to observe, is even some sorting of students, right? So it is possible that some of the more selective institutions in the state are receiving more racially or socioeconomically diverse incoming cohorts. And in our working with averages, that could be being washed out by where those students are coming from more open access institutions. And so I think to Dominique's point, this is what exactly warrants more information and partnerships. And why Jennifer and I and our entire research team are really thankful to be partnering with some other states who are thinking about these policies as well.
I
Taylor,
just want to add in.
Oh, if I
Oh,
can
I'm
hop
sorry.
in
Sure, go ahead.
briefly, just to the University of Idaho has seen an increase in Hispanic enrollment, and I can't speak to the other institutions. It's not huge, but it's significant. We've also had some sort of focus group meetings with some of our Hispanic students or Latinx students, and this is certainly doesn't rise to the quantitative research, Taylor, that you do, but a number of those students, a fairly large number, basically say, oh, this was such an incredible relief to get my direct admissions letter, and it made a huge difference to my family. They said, oh, now you've got to go, kind of thing. And so consistent with some of the comments that Jennifer had highlighted in one of her slides, that is what we're hearing through our Office of Multicultural Affairs from some of those students. And I don't know what percentage or something like that.
I just wanted to add in one more thing before we move on to the next question. And it's something I raised when we were in Illinois, and Chuck, that you and I have talked about since, and you've mentioned here. For anyone any state considering implementing this, systems, whatever, my thing I'm begging you to do in terms of insights to give other states is please get practitioners engaged at the very beginning of the conversation. Get school counselors, get admissions folks, get people who do the work and have to implement this engaged from the go, because it just goes better. And it's just the soapbox that I've been on a lot lately. So
yeah,
well,
so kind of tagging on to that is a question about the language Common App has been used, floated in some of the presentations. And so the question becomes, in the admissions work world, the term Common Application or Common App refers very specifically to the Common App, right? And so when you all are talking about Common Application, do you mean partnering with the Common App, or are you talking about like for instance, I know in California there is a UC-wide application. Like, what are you referring to in that?
Well, yeah, and I'll take that in Idaho if it's all right. We're not. Although we do actually use or accept the Common App, that's a totally separate path, the classic Common App, I'll call it. What we are talking about is I'll call it a universal application process for high school students from Idaho. And
so a statewide
Common App for Idaho students. And at the University of Idaho and also at Boise State and all of our other sister institutions, students from outside the state are not able to use that same application process because our state doesn't have their student data.
So I think this is one where just English sort of fails us a bit because everything sort of has the same terms. But yeah, we're talking about institutions coming together and agreeing on what information they need out of an application. Where we've seen this sort of shift in both Idaho and South Dakota has been because you can import students' information from the state longitudinal data system, and you essentially already have their high school and their background and their address and all of that. It's really more focused on, you're choosing your spot, you're picking your major. A few institutions ask for like residence hall, and if you want a roommate match, that sort of thing. So it isn't, by pre-populating the application, in part, it's the institutions agreeing that we need the same information. We're not going to each ask separate and slightly different questions of students, that we're sort of the institutions are going to decide on what's common, simplify that process for students. So it's one set of questions across the institutions. But we can't imagine having the private nonprofit Common App or coalition or any of those applications. That also reduces frictions. And we've seen sort of variants across states in this. Apply Texas is sort of a more complicated system where institutions can put on their own questions. University of Wisconsin system has one where each campus has their own system. Uyan mentioned the University of California one. There's agreement across the campuses, more agreement. So it is sort of moving in that direction between the sort of clearinghouse type of common application or universal application to something a little more agreed upon by the institutions to help make that more simple from the student's viewpoint in terms of what a universal application looks like. Okay,
yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I think there's some confusion, right? I mean, English fails us in this way. Another question we have is, as colleges move away from standardized testing for admission, along with variations of grading policy, even within the state, isn't reliance on these factors fairly problematic? What more can be assessed, and that's in quotation marks, or proven as far as college readiness and or success upon enrollment? And I'll copy this into the chat room for everyone to read. But that is the question. If anyone wants to take it.
Yeah, the vast majority of students in Idaho are admitted on the basis of they're fully admissible on the basis of their high school GPA. Now, high school GPAs have been shown to be pretty good predictors of college success, and alone. And of course, standardized test scores are not completely without their ability to predict student success, but they're not absolute by any means predictor of college success. So I think it's less than 10% of those directly admitted to the selective institutions would not have been admitted without a test score, kind of thing. So it's in Idaho relatively small, but depending upon where a state or an institution would be setting its thresholds and what their expectations are, I can imagine that varying quite a bit in terms of implementation from what I'd call the Idaho model. I hope that makes some sense. So we could as a state almost go test optional completely, and I don't think it would make much difference in who we were admitting to this program.
Dude, okay, just saying, you could go test optional, or you could go crazy and do like Northern Illinois just did and go test, we don't need it all together. Just test, nah, thanks. Just saying, if you're going to go out there, take the leap.
So I was just going to throw out that so I've been reading a lot, right, about what do lotteries potentially look like, what do they rely on, because really when we think about what Idaho's doing with selective institutions, it is that sort of like, once we have this threshold, then these are the students that are directly admitted. And so almost every simulation of this that has been done before is done with either GPA or SAT scores as some sort of academic threshold of preparedness or readiness. And I think that's a great question because, right, I don't know how many of us had a ton of time this week to read through all of the UC faculty's report. I did my best. It's clear Oyad had tons of time and just was able to flip all the way through, right? But, right, like, I think of a lot of this, different states are taking different approaches to looking at this. So in California, this report was done using UC information that the authors argue that the predictability of high school GPA is actually decreasing over time when it comes to predicting a first-year GPA in comparison to their test scores. This is one of the reasons that they argue that they should not go test optional, right? And that's a very different environment than the Idaho environment that we are talking about. So I think this comes back to a little bit what Taylor said, that we have to be thinking about what localities or states, different things like that, what is the best in their environment. But I think it's a completely fine thing to say, like, what does it mean to actually measure what is academic preparedness? I think that when we think that's right, this also comes back to the idea of what is merit. When we talk about these types of things, we have these socially constructed, group constructed ideas that don't always actually align with sort of what we are actually thinking that we're measuring. So I think it's a perfectly fine thing to question and want to push on thinking, what does academic preparedness mean? What does it look like? And how do we make sure that we're actually gauging academic preparedness and not proxies for students' income or wealth?
So a lot packed into that question. So anyone else want to jump on that? I do have two other questions in the queue, and we have 5 minutes left.
So I'll just say briefly on that question, you know, that it's thinking about using thresholds for something like a proactive admissions process doesn't fully replace an admissions process. So, you know, a student who's not admitted under direct admissions, but might be a fabulous pianist or a great football player, you know, might be applying to institutions that they didn't get directly admitted to because they've got some other skills. Out-of-state students, international students, like regular admission still is functional at these institutions. I think, you know, the idea would be set a high threshold and use that to be able to push information to students from your local, you know, your local state, your local community, where you kind of know practices in high school, as you know what's available in terms of either you know, sort of junior year testing in high school or standardized college admissions exams. But it is not a wholesale replacement of admissions practices. It's simply moving more students and doing that data match to send information, give information proactively to students.
Okay, so we have two more questions. One is, perhaps I missed this, but how do you resolve the increase in overall undergraduate enrollment being so much larger than the increase in first-time in-state students?
So I think that's a good question and something that we're also thinking about. I should note too that, you know, in the appendix, undergraduate enrollment at the data that we're able to view is measured at the institutional level. So it's across all students enrolled that meet that undergraduate criterion. And students who are considered in-state for our analysis are those in the incoming cohort. And so naturally, any effect, I think, would be much smaller anyways. Again, given kind of these like data availability and the number of years we're able to observe for these variables, I'm most confident in this time, or more confident, I should say, in our synthetic control point estimates for both of those outcomes. And those estimates are actually relatively similar. They're both right at about 150 students overall at an insignificant level, but more precisely at the in-state undergraduate level. So something to keep exploring. And like Dominique was mentioning earlier, like it would be really interesting for us to be able to view these outcomes at an institutional level, or at least at a more level to you know, collapse by selectivity or something. But with 8 institutions, it's you know, we're not too confident, you know, and are able to be more precise about some of those more detailed questions.
Okay, so I have 2 more, I keep saying 2 more questions, but I really do have 2 more questions again. But I'm gonna blend the 2 because they kind of piggyback off of each other. So one of the questions has been, what has the response of high school counselors been in Idaho? And also, how has Idaho provided assistance to students in navigating college decision processes? What advice might they provide to states who are considering adopting an automatic admissions policy? I guess around the supports and how school counselors and so forth been providing supports.
Actually, we know that when we rolled this process out so quickly and without working with the stakeholders, we generated some real friction with the school counselors in Idaho. And I think for the most part, that's been resolved and they understand the process much better and we have more extensive communication. Although I'm not aware of surveys that we've done of school counselors, et cetera. And I've forgotten the second part of your question, Oyan.
It's generally about, so if the rollout was so quick and, you know, there needed to be more communication, what kind of supports or maybe even training for the school counselors, I guess, like how are they being prepared to support students in navigating these new processes or making sure that things are going smoothly? Yeah,
I think that again was certainly a weakness initially. Now I think that we've worked through some of the we have regional superintendents meetings and things like that, and we've worked through those kinds of organizations to get information out there better. Our own admissions staff, frankly, didn't understand the process very well the first year either. And again, now they've worked and they work with a lot of school counselors. So I think that we're in better shape now. But what I guess I'd recommend to anyone who's thinking about implementing this sort of process is to do it better than we did in terms of working with those stakeholders up front.
Yeah, and I've also heard from practitioner friends that the Texas process is also, there's a lot of raised eyebrows amongst practitioners on the ground. I will leave it there. And then a follow-up question, yes, and are school counselors seeing this as a positive element in supporting post-secondary success? So follow up to what we were just talking about.
I don't know if Taylor or Jennifer have more information on that. I don't have a lot of information about that widely. I have some anecdotal information in which generally those counselors with whom I've spoken do see this as a positive at this point, but I don't, that's not survey data or anything like that.
So I think for me, one of the metrics of success in this is just, I mentioned before that there are now 2 private post-secondary institutions part of the system, but there's also been demand in Idaho from private high schools to be part of the system. So it's working well enough. Students, friends, or siblings were getting these letters if they're at a public school, but privates weren't. So more privates are coming on, and also more schools from the Bureau of Indian Affairs are coming on online. So, you know, to me, that's sort of a metric that this is working well, and that schools, even private institutions that don't need to share their data, are doing so voluntarily because they see the benefits for their students. And I think a lot of that's coming from counselors and high school principals in the private and BEA schools.
Thank you so much. I know we're at time. We're a little over time, so I just want to thank our panelists for joining us today. I know that Marie has been kind of sending me little messages saying that there's a lot of buzz out there in the accept world. And so thank you for your leadership and your research insights. Marie, would you like the final word?
Oh gosh, just thanks to everyone for sharing your time, for the great speakers. Again, I'm so glad that I was able to be there for this conversation in Champaign, because it really, it just opened my eyes to thinking about things in such a different way, and to see the collaboration was super cool. So thank you for joining us and sharing this, and thanks to everyone out there who joined us tonight.